This week, OpenAI's leaked projections show that they're going to spend $115 billion between now and 2029. That's $80 billion more than they'd forecast to spend just earlier this year. In today's episode, we're going to follow this money trail and try to understand exactly what the real cost of OpenAI reaching AGI is going to be, and where all of this money is going to go. This is In the Loop with Jack Horton. I hope you enjoy the show. So let's start with the crazy spending figures, because OpenAI are now projecting and expecting to burn $115 billion between now and 2029. So to put that into context, that's about $10 billion more than they initially projected. And broadly, they're expecting to burn over $8 billion this year and then $17 billion next year. And losses are expected to peak at about $45 billion in 2028 before apparently turning profitable in 2030, which is initially a year later than they actually hoped for. Now, you may be wondering, what's actually the big driver of all this cost? Like, where does the money actually go? And well, as I'll go through today, it's compute and training costs. Because OpenAI are pouring money into data centers and chips, and as I'll come on to, potentially training data to fund their business. One of the big spending sprees is going to come through building data centers as part of Project Stargate. For example, their partnership with Oracle. Now, Project Stargate is a huge initiative to build out essentially a massive network of mega AI data centers. And in July, OpenAI and Oracle announced a deal to add 4.5 gigawatts of new cloud capacity across the US. To put this into context, that's the equivalent of 2 Hoover dams, which would power 4 million homes. This 4.55 gigawatt expansion is part of Stargate's big objective to invest about $500 billion into 10 gigawatts of AI infrastructure by 2029. Again, these data centers are the key to making AI work. The plan is to run about 2 million new AI chips across these Stargate sites that's going to enable and unlock that 10 gigawatt capacity, which is a lot of money. Roughly, I think, about $30,000 to $40,000 per high-end chip. You're looking at about $60 to $80 billion in hardware purchases to fuel the 2 million AI chips needed for Stargate. And that's before considering replacements and upgrades and expansion. To put that into context again, no cloud project has really ever tried to assemble this much compute under a single umbrella. And as you can see here, it's why the likes of NVIDIA's data center revenue is just exploding from virtually nothing to many tens of billions per year. And this is where I think the economics of this business model is really interesting to those listening. Because if you actually start to break down maybe who captures what in that $1 transaction for some sort of AI service, roughly. So maybe a big slice, maybe 25 to 40 cents of that $1 goes towards paying for GPU hardware, which basically goes straight to NVIDIA because they're the ones selling GPUs. Another slice, let's say 10 to 20 cents, might go to that cloud provider who owns the data center to pay for power and cooling and rent and obviously profit. And then maybe the remaining 30 cents goes to the AI firm's costs, research data and stuff, and then hopefully trying to turn that into profit. So it's very, very expensive. And now it's probably no surprise to anybody that OpenAI are trying to now invest in their own data centers and chips. So OpenAI and Broadcom are going to aim to produce their first in-house chip and processor by 2026. And if OpenAI shifts to custom chips with Broadcom, hosted in maybe self-run or partner-run data centers, it obviously will reduce dramatically the amount of money NVIDIA makes, and also the likes of Microsoft and Amazon and the data center providers. And the end result is that more of that $1 will just go to OpenAI's margin. And well, that's the theory anyway. And to me, this article breaking down the real finances of this update really shows that OpenAI are clearly trying to grab the lead in infrastructure and to capture all that future revenue and potential. So by outspending others and building out the infrastructure, which reduces their own costs long term, they're trying to secure their future. So they're actually looking at a major jump in revenue to keep up with all these costs. And so they're expecting a total revenue about $13 billion this year, which is $300 million higher than their earlier forecast this year. And by 2030, they're expecting $200 billion in revenue, which is 15% higher than they previously estimated. And most of this they're expecting to come through ChatGPT. Again, so if they can get their business model off the reliance of the expensive NVIDIA chips and not relying so heavily on very expensive data centers, their profits go up and their margins go up. Now, what I would say is that this plan to escape that dependency can very easily backfire. There's a reason that not many companies have managed to squeeze their way into the data center industry or the chip industry. They're apparently spending about $10 billion with Broadcom to develop these custom chips. But it's very risky and it's very expensive because if their custom chips do not work or they underperform or they get delayed, they're stuck buying the NVIDIA chips anyway, potentially much worse off after spending billions on a completely failed project. And plus, most other big companies like Google and Microsoft are also producing their own chips. So by the time the chip arrives, maybe all the advantages are very short-lived. Who knows? Though you might also argue that therefore they have absolutely no choice because their competitors are going to spend huge amounts of money, and if they're producing their own chips, OpenAI must also compete on this front, otherwise it's game over. Now, these things that they're trying to do are really not easy. It's worth noting, I guess there's huge need for power and money to fuel this business model. It's insane. For example, in 2023, data centers were taking up about 4.4% of all electricity in the US. And it's expected to triple by 2028. And also, they just take a huge amount of time to get going. For example, the time to connect a new project to the grid is about 5 to 7 years. Again, you can't just build a data center and plug it into the wall. You have to actually work with the national grid to get it integrated. And there's massive queues to obviously get that going. And we're literally seeing companies like Microsoft and Meta partner with nuclear plants and natural gas providers to try and fuel these data centers. Again, there's something to note here from an environmental impact perspective. It's worth doing the reading and analysis. It's going to have a massive impact on the environment, of course. I hope, and I really hope, that we continue along the line of a massive amount of efficiency gains continually every year. So it becomes more efficient. We waste less water because obviously this amount of data center and this amount of power is going to continually make a very negative impact long term for the environment. Although I do think we'll increase efficiencies and the net gain overall of more intelligence for every single person and society as a whole will pay off. Anyway, this is why data centers make so much money. Only a handful of companies in the world typically are able to do this, and they're called hyperscalers, the likes of Google and Microsoft and Amazon. And I think a great example of this is Oracle. They've spent about $20 billion this year just on data centers, and much of it's just to service OpenAI's initial investment. And I guess the beauty of this business model really is that cloud providers have very limited risk. They're essentially renting servers to other AI companies. Now, they have to put a huge amount of cash and time up front to even be able to rent that out. But if OpenAI goes bankrupt, they'll just try and rent the servers out to someone else. Or at least that's the theory. And this is really one of the big problems right now with the business model of AI, because data centers plus chips cost a huge amount of money. And this is where a lot of the talk of bubbles has come from. Because really, if a huge amount of the revenue being captured is being captured from just a handful of small companies, then it obviously stirs up conversations of a bubble. Because all it takes is a handful of companies to go wrong and collapse, and it's seemingly game over. Now, I've done in a previous episode just a couple of weeks ago why I do not think we're in a full bubble, but I would expect some form of correction in the coming period. But I'll get onto that again a little bit further into the episode. It's worth going also on to something that's just happened in the last week as well, that's going to cause a huge amount of extra or unexpected investment by the likes of OpenAI just to train their models. Until now, most companies in the AI space that are training models treated data as free. They would scrape text from books, from websites, and they would rarely ever pay. And that era is coming to an end because this week Anthropic have finally agreed to pay a $1.5 billion settlement that covers 500,000 books, which puts the cost of a book roughly at $3,000 each. Now, the lawyers have called it the largest copyright recovery in history. On top of that, Anthropic are having to delete all of the data from pirated books that they'd previously stored. And the settlement doesn't even grant a blanket right to generate text based on those books. So Anthropic could still face claims if Claude's outputs infringe copyright. So you can just imagine the potential ramifications of something like this happening in the AI industry to an OpenAI, to other big providers in this race to AGI. And if you add a historical comparison to this huge amount of infrastructure build out and fear, but also excitement in society right now, there are great historical comparisons. For example, during Britain's massive railway, what's described as railway mania in the 1840s, railway investments peaked at about 7% of GDP per year. And then during the dot-com bubble peak around the early 2000s, the tech and telecom industries we're spending about 1.5 to 2% of US GDP on infrastructure. Now, to put that into context, AI-related data center spending in 2025 is expected to reach about 2% of US GDP. So already matching that dot-com bubble peak. Now, just like in the railway mania and the dot-com bubble, lots of these companies collapsed and, we were left with huge amounts of redundant train line. So the key question really is, are we going to end up with more GPU capacity than we actually need or use? Or is demand truly that big? Now, I could be wrong, and I do expect some form of correction in the incoming period, but I do not expect it to be like the dot-com era. So in conclusion, we're seeing one of the biggest infrastructure spends in history. Companies with $115 billion burn rates. History suggests that we may then see a correction, and this spend might not be something that can be maintained for that long. To me, it just shows that this path to AGI, whatever you define that as, is going to cost a seriously large amount of money. And the biggest companies in the world are betting everything on them being first to reach whatever that definition might be. I, for one, am just excited to watch this play out. Thank you for listening. This is In the Loop, and I'll see you next week.